Marilyn, who will be speaking on step 2. Step 10, Marilyn, who will be speaking on step 3.
Okay. Good morning. I am Marilyn, and I am an alcoholic. Thank you, Alan. Thank you for that reading. Alan has been acting as my host, and he is my longtime friend in the Pacific Group, so this has been very sweet. And I thank all of you for being here. I thank State Line, everybody who was part of the planning of State Line. We meet once a year for this intense weekend of non-sleep, constant talks, and go home a different person, and a better person usually. So it's good to be here. I'm going to use some notes because I'm very old. And so I apologize to many of you whose name I can't remember. And I can't even remember my own. I'm so grateful for these name tags. Yes, this is who I am. Here we go. I'm going to talk about, as Alan said, step 3. Step 3 is so interesting. It's so combined with step 12 in my mind. Step 12 talks about the main point of this program is a spiritual awakening. And that spiritual awakening allows us to carry out the other parts of step 12, which are to carry the message to alcoholics, our message of recovery, and also to practice these principles in all of our affairs. And step 3 is, I think, a gateway to that long journey of recovery, that long journey that allows us to have that spiritual awakening. The person I like to read, Anthony DeMello, talks about awakening a lot. In fact, he tells the story about a mom going into her son, who's in bed, sound asleep. "Wake up, son, time to get up." And he says, "Let me sleep, I'm so tired." So she goes away, and then she comes back and says, "You really have to get up now." "Why do I have to get up?" he says. "Because it's time for school, and you're the principal." Now, I didn't start waking up until I was 32 years old. And I woke up, started to wake up. Actually, I was kind of sitting in my garage, having been drinking for a long time. But it had started... do I have some water here? Yes. It had started out much like the reading that Alan gave us, searching. There was something deep inside that longed to communicate with something, that longed to have a relationship with something. And I mistook it for science. I felt that science could explain just about everything. And if I could become a scientist, then I could become a happy person. And as time went by, I had a saintly mom, so I could study science, and I went to a good university. I met and married a scientist. We went to California. I was a scientist. I had a white lab coat. I had all of the reagents that I needed for experiments. I had a research project, and I was beginning to think, no, that's not quite it. It had seemed so right. It answers those deep questions that I think that many of us ask, like, what is this all about? Why are we here? And yet it was just, that was not it. I discovered what I thought was it, and it was right on the shelf in the lab, and it was 90% ethanol, a very good drink. So I thought, no, it wasn't science, it's this. And it was that for a long time. And it gave me that feeling that I had been searching for comfort in the present moment. I'm right here, right now. I'm not afraid of people anymore. I love everybody. I love my work. I'm going to win the Nobel Prize. In step 2, we talk about insanity, being restored to sanity. And I mean, obviously, we're insane. Self-preservation is absolutely fundamental. And every living creature has that self-preservation instinct. But somehow when we drink, we lose track of that one, and we drink ourselves to death. So that's obviously insane. But another manifestation of my insanity was that while I was drinking that very good stuff on the lab shelf and going out to bars every night and drinking at home all the time, I just had this delusion that I am doing this great work, and actually I'd stopped working. And that seemed to be the end of my career. And that's how I got to the garage. I was at home at first, but gave birth to 3 little children. And after the first one, my husband was terrified and imported adult supervision, namely mother-in-law and my mother, that alternated. So I had to take to my garage most of the time because I was afraid of them. They had taken my place, and I hated them for that. And that was fear, obviously. Our book talks about fear being the chief instigator of so many of our character defects. So when I'm afraid, then I just build up hatred. So I was sitting there with resentment, drinking in the garage. I noticed the ants that came in every day, and I thought about that. Why? Why are there so many ants? Well, my favorite drink was beer by that time, because it sustains you. It's plenty of liquid, so you don't have to drink anything else. Loads of food, lots of calories. It's that all-purpose drink. And yet, like that movie Airplane, I had a drinking problem. I would lift up the can of beer and pour it down my back, just kind of miss my face. And so it would evaporate on the floor and draw in these ants because it has many, many sugars, and it was party time. But I studied them, and these simple creatures, we think of them as simple creatures, but they had friends, they had jobs, and I missed it all. And I was sitting in my garage, and I had lost that. Now I realize, especially in Larsine's wonderful talk, she talked about a kind of orchestration that I have come to experience. I can't explain it, but I know it has something to do with our higher power. But she illustrated it by asking God for a distraction, and a spider crawled into her ear, which was a wonderful distraction. And so I think that the ants were telling me something. In this great orchestration in the universe, I looked at them, and they were okay because they lived in a community. And the message for me was, you need a recovery community. You cannot live in isolation and do well. You will die. Just like the social insects, we can get such a lesson from them. Bees together in a hive do very, very well. Each bee has a job to do, friends, purpose, and they go out and they make honey, and there's queens that lay eggs, and they all have a certain function, just like we have in Alcoholics Anonymous. And as in Alcoholics Anonymous, the social insects have to stay together. And if one drifts away and gets lost from the hive or the anthill, they die. They cannot live without the community. And I found that to be true. Luckily, this program has kept me sober for a lot of years, but friends have wandered away. And outside of our community, they usually do not do well. But I didn't understand that message. What I did hear from my mother-in-law was, unless you go to Alcoholics Anonymous and get sober, we're going to lock you up and you'll never see the children again. You know, just that encouragement. And so the time was right for a decision to be made. And I had this idea that I can do this alone, but I couldn't. And so I made a phone call, and in 1972 I was taken into the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. I did not understand what was going on. I did not understand anything about it. But I had that kind of desperation and hopelessness that I think is absolutely necessary. Our friend Kent from Ohio, my home place, talked a lot about the history of Alcoholics Anonymous and the gift from Carl Jung. Bill W. Wrote to Carl Jung in 1961 and acknowledged the contribution, which we read about in our big book, pages 27, 28 are some of my favorite pages, and just talked about that need for a conversion experience, an awakening. We have to wake up and find recovery. And somehow Carl Jung could not produce that in Roland Hazard, but he recognized it. He responded to Bill in a beautiful letter and talked about spirits. He even said the Latin, spiritus contra spiritum, meaning that the spirits of alcoholic spirits, work against the spirit, higher power. While I was drinking, obviously, I was so cut off from anything that was trying to help me, anything that hinted of recovery. That spirit that I was drinking opposed recovery. But in contrast, once we come to the fellowship and through this program find recovery, that contradicts the need to drink, that somehow that deep thirst for alcohol is replaced by a thirst for recovery itself. So he was absolutely right, and Bill recognized that. But in the beginning, I was fully dependent on the program of recovery. And how do we get that? I think that, first of all, surrender to the program is absolutely essential, but it's not sufficient. It has to be followed by a program of recovery. Roland Hazard surrendered to the good doctor, of course, but without that program that somehow he could not receive from Jung, he had to return to spirits of the alcoholic form. So when we come here, what was it about this program that drew me in? Well, of course, it was the stories that we tell one another. There was a wonderful priest in Los Angeles, Father Terry R., and I went to many of his retreats, and he would say constantly, identify, don't compare. Identify, don't compare. Well, that's kind of abstract, but what happened was that I listened to the person who became my sponsor, the wonderful Marilyn W., my first sponsor, and she told a story about fear, about an unhealthy dependency on her husband. She used the image of him walking around the kitchen. She was holding onto his ankles, being dragged along on the floor. And I thought, yes, that's the story of my life. You're telling my story. And I looked at her and I fell in love with her. And there was something deep inside that said, listen, this is important. It was so convincing that I ran up to her afterwards and I said, would you be my sponsor? And she said, it would be a privilege. Wow. Where else? What other club can you go into? Like the country club? one of those like PTA Rotary clubs, as Mike S., who was a wonderful speaker last night, talked about those animal clubs, the elks, the moose, the... Just go up to a complete stranger and say, "Can you take control of my life? I mean, I'm so needy. Help. I might need to sleep on your couch." I mean, they probably wouldn't say it would be a privilege. But Marion did, and she took me to the Pacific Group. Of course, many of you remember the leader and founder of the Pacific Group, Clancy, who was a frequent visitor to State Line. He said a wonderful thing, which I have to read because I love the words of it, and I'm not good at memorizing. Clancy said, "We start believing that someone knows how we feel, and we let them overrule our judgments so that we take action. The beginning is when a person partakes of one alcoholic talking to another alcoholic to help them reduce their feelings of difference, at least enough so that they will begin to take actions that they do not yet believe in. And when that moment comes, sobriety begins." And that says a lot. It says, I don't have to believe in anything you're telling me, but I need to make that surrender and take actions. Now, our step 3 prayer says to God, "I want you to take my life, and I ask you to just wrap me up and control me and take away my difficulties," asking all these big things. But in asking for my will to be taken over to the care of God was just a little bit scary. But I had fallen in love with my sponsor, so I had given my will and my life over to the care of Marion, which seemed to be just fine. And I've come to believe that higher power works especially through sponsors. And sponsors can be idiots. But they do so much better than I do. And I've had 3 wonderful sponsors, and somehow their wisdom has sustained me. And so it's so wonderful that I can turn my will and my life over to the care of a sponsor. And my higher power has worked through that. But initially, when I was confronted with this idea of God, because I came pretty much as an atheist or agnostic, I believed in science, as I said. Science let me down, but nevertheless, I was jaded with this idea. You have to be able to do experiments on it before it's real. And so Marion encouraged me to pray, eventually to take the 3rd step prayer and give my will and my life over to the care of God as I understand God. But that was scary. There was a fellow in our group, Clint H., that said that he went to a church where people were sitting and wrapping up bandages to send away to people who had given their will and their life over to the care of a higher power. So that was kind of scary. I mean, you can give your will and your life over, and then it's out of my control. And where will I be sent? What will I be asked to do? Well, when my life was under my own control, I was a failure in the lab. My family had given up on me. I was worthless in the garage. That was my control. And so it was tempting. But can we trust God? Can we really trust God if God is there? There's a wonderful Sufi story about the wise fool Nasruddin. And he was sitting under a great big walnut tree, and there was shade, and he was happy. And he looked out over a field of pumpkins, and these great big pumpkins were growing on these spindly little vines. And he thought, this great creator of the universe, God has just made a mistake here. I mean, these spindly vines are supporting great big pumpkins, whereas this enormous, strong walnut tree is supporting only tiny walnuts. this is surely a mistake. And as he sat there, there was a gentle breeze that began to pick up, and some walnuts broke off, and one fell on his head. And he realized, oh, I am so sorry, God. I now see your wisdom, because if it had been my way, a pumpkin would have fallen on my head. And so in the moment, sometimes it seems like that can't be right, but if it's my sponsor's direction, if it's my higher power working through a sponsor, it's usually a good idea. As Clancy says, we take these actions that we don't yet believe in, and it has worked well for me. There was a person that came to visit our group quite often. That was the great Chuck C. Now, he was Clancy's sponsor, so we saw him at Clancy's birthday time, and he spoke in our group. I heard him talk, and there was something so attractive about him. And a lot of that attraction was that he knew a great big thing. And I wanted to know what that was. What did he have that allowed him to be so radiant, so joyful, so powerful? He talked about God the Father. He even said, he's the pappy and we're his kids. He was from Texas, and he had kind of a Texas accent. And I listened, and he talked about infinite Father, infinite child. There's always going to be as much ahead of us as there is right now. And that sounded like science to me. Infinite Father, infinite child. It was magic. His words were magic. So I became kind of a groupie. I would find out where he was speaking, and I went around to listen to him. And that's when I think some of our character defects can be used for recovery. I mean, obviously, the one unhealthy parasitic attachment to people for me was good, because I attached to Marion. I'll do anything. Just like me. Please, just pat me on the head and say, you are good. So I was taking these actions that I didn't yet believe in. But likewise, I had deep envy for what Chuck C. had. And that worked well. So in one magic moment, I was all alone, and I said a prayer that amounted to the third step prayer, and the seventh step prayer kind of rolled into one for me. And it was, if you're there, if you're really there, I would like to know you. I would like to have experience of you. And if you really are there, I am willing to go on any path you pick for me. And it made my heart beat fast. But in my mind, in my soul, I gave it all over to this higher power that I had come to trust just because of these examples in Alcoholics Anonymous. Not only Chuck C., it was also Marion, Clancy, people who had this belief and trust. We're doing so much better than everybody else. And so that prayer, just nothing happened in the moment that I made that prayer. Nothing like the movies, where Charlton Heston, Moses, burning bush, chariots flaming, not even loud music. But in the year that followed, I was introduced to our other steps, which we'll hear about very soon, 4 through 9, which I think are those essential steps that bring about this thing that Carl Jung could not give to Roland Hazard. These things that allow this transformation that's described so nicely in our book around page 27, 28. We need these deep emotional displacements and rearrangements. Old concepts are swept away, replaced by new ones. And when that happens, that negative emotional debris is somehow cast aside, and we begin to have some kind of clear vision that we are not the center of the universe. I was so locked in with all kinds of defenses that had to be broken down. And I felt those defenses were wonderful. They protected me from you. They protected me. But really, they become walls, and they're a prison. So I was isolated from you, from nature, certainly from a higher power. There's a wonderful person in Los Angeles, Father Greg Boyle, not in our program, so I can use his last name. But he runs Homeboys, and he has rehabilitated many, many gang members. And he talks about that. He talks about not building big high walls, just build a bigger table. And I think that's what we're challenged to do. Tear down the walls and welcome to my table. Let's all sit here at the banquet. And so as that began to happen, one day, when enough of those walls were broken down, enough of the internal rearrangement and displacement occurred, the veil parted, and I came into contact with a God of my very own, and it was that realization, you've been there all along, haven't you? It was obvious the moment it was obvious, but not a moment before. So it was fairly sudden for me. I have a friend, Diana. We have been friends for 52 years now, because this program has kept me sober for 53. And we met when I was 1 year sober, felt like an old-timer. And she came in, and I took her under my wing to show her this program that I so completely understood at that moment. But we did. We became great pals. And so anyway, I forgot where I was going with that. I told you I'm old and forgetful. But anyway, this whole idea of I know what it is. Yes, Diana back. Who am I? Marilyn. Yes, Diana and I have walked this path together, and we have about the same impression of higher power and God, and we talk a lot about that. We've talked endlessly about the journey. Hers has been the educational variety. Mine has been in sudden steps. And the first one, as I said, just one day it all opened up in a great, big, wonderful, wonderful spiritual experience. And then plateau for a long time, and then another one. And so I think that certainly both are valid. But in the beginning, I was wondering about these spiritual experiences, especially the huge one that Bill had in his hospital room, which I never had one so overwhelming. Now, how do we know that is real contact with a higher power? We don't. There is no way to know that. There are people in mental hospitals who have visions like that every day, all the time. And so how do we know? I think we know 10 years later. Is a spiritual experience real contact with higher power? Have we broken those walls down and established that, as we say, conscious contact? Well, obviously, look at Bill Wilson. He was dying of alcoholism. No doubt that he was a hopeless alcoholic, and yet after that kind of spiritual experience, that contact that somehow was this great gift from higher power, he founded, along with Dr. Bob, the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and millions of people now are sober and alive who would otherwise be dead. So I think that that's how we know. We just have to wait for a little while. But with this awakening that I had, I just thought, okay, I am well now, and this will be wonderful. There was kind of a high of that for a while, but real life impinges, and the way grows weary and hard. But I was recovering, and Clancy said another thing that kind of tells my story, that we make the massive surrender. We throw in the towel, he said. And I certainly did, while I was hopeless and helpless, and woke up and realized that I'm going to go on God power. I'll hear it from my sponsor, I'll hear it in some way, but you can have it all. But then, with recovery, I became convincing as just a normal human being out in the world. I went out, I went back to school, I went back to work, and passed for normal. And then I began to do what Clancy says, we throw in the towel, and then we begin to take it back, just piece by piece. I'll just tear off a corner here. And then we pull it in a little bit, rip off a little bit more, and then pretty soon I'm kind of controlling my own life because I know what's good for me. Better job, that's good. This whole idea of money, property, prestige, money, property, authority, for me, they were very tempting. Of course they are. They're so delicious. And yet they're obviously lesser gods, lesser powers. And with a lesser God, I have a lesser life, obviously. And so I began to notice that these character defects that got tucked away with 6 and 7, they can come back too, under stress, under meeting deadlines, under competition at work. Just shortcuts, just tell a few lies again. It won't hurt. It will help me get what I want. Ambition, competition, lesser gods. And so when I was about, the years 10 to 15 were those really striving years where I want to make up for lost time. I've got to make something of myself. I've got to get back into science. I did make amends to the director of that lab. He invited me back to work there because he was clearly insane. But there I was trying to make living amends. And yet life was getting a little bit gray. And why was that? Well, I was still going to meetings. I thought of myself as an alcoholic. I sponsored 1 or 2 people. I dropped out of the Pacific group. We'd moved up to San Francisco for a while. I'd gone back to Los Angeles and was back at school. Quiet, dark, quiet meetings. And there was a singer, Peggy Lee, around that time, singing, "Is that all there is? Is that all there is, my friend?" And I was thinking, is that all there is? I mean, I have a job, the family, I've made amends as best I can, we're getting along, I've got a cat, life is not bad, but it's kind of gray. And thank God, when I was about 15 years sober, I'm sure with the help of friends in Alcoholics Anonymous, it's kind of a reminder, where are you? We haven't heard from you. But what really helped was realizing that I had been happier before, back in the Pacific group when I was fully invested. And I remembered people like Clancy and Marion. Marion had moved away. She was no longer my sponsor. I didn't have a sponsor at that time. And the happy people were the ones that were fully invested in the fellowship, being of service. And I knew that I wasn't. And I thank my higher power for somehow that message getting through to me, because I knew what I had to do. So I knew that I had to be of service. When I had that moment of realization, I was actually out of the country. I was in Israel with my daughter, Susie, and she was standing on the Sea of Galilee, this old historical place, with her arms out and the wind was blowing. And I don't know what it was about that, but I just had that moment. I'm sorry, higher power. I have just been living selfishly again. Put me to service. Bring me back into a place where I'm useful. Please, I'm not really helping very many people. I'm competing with them. And I got this vision, this realization go to Calcutta and turn yourself over to Mother Teresa. And so, okay, all right. So I mentioned it to my daughter Susie, who doesn't drink. She's not an alcoholic, and she listened to that, and she said, "That's interesting. But why don't you talk to some of your AA friends about that?" So we came back to the States, and I was in touch with them, and especially my friend Diana, and she said, "That's interesting. But you're not Catholic, you don't know the languages of India, you have a family here that you probably should take care of. Maybe just maybe, you should just get more deeply involved in Alcoholics Anonymous, where you understand that language." So I thought, well, maybe she's right. And what better way than to throw myself back into the Pacific group? So I went back when I was about 16 years sober, and didn't have a sponsor at that time, though. And Diana was acting as my sponsor. And that worked because she's always been brutally honest with me. And she's been right most of those times. So, but I suggest that you have a sponsor. I've done much better while I've had a sponsor. But I was in the Pacific group again, and a person, Mary M., would visit my office almost on a daily basis, and she would say, "I'm so glad you're back, but you don't have a sponsor, and it needs to be Clancy." And I said, "But I'm afraid of Clancy." And she said, "No, I think you need somebody strong." And I would say, "Okay," and she would go away, and I'd forget about it. But she came periodically and would drop into my office where I worked because she was visiting somebody in the same institution. And "You need a sponsor, it needs to be Clancy." So one day I said, "Okay," and she gave me a number. And so I called him and went down to see him at the Midnight Mission. And I said that I'm here because Mary says I need to talk to you, and I needed to have a sponsor. But I'm afraid of you. And he said, "I am very scary. But I am willing if you will make sure that you show up at our Wednesday night meeting every Wednesday." And I had thrown myself back into the group, and actually I was going to 7 meetings a week. I was going to Clancy's backyard on Saturday. I was going to the moves. I was doing all of those things. And he noticed things, and he said, "Just keep up all that action, but make sure you're always there on Wednesday night." And he became my sponsor. He was my sponsor for 30 years until he passed away. And as I said, I've had 3 wonderful sponsors, and the amazing thing is, and I'm sure they're gifts from my higher power, because I've been led to these people in such an amazing way. But they've always been perfect for that period of sobriety that I am in. And I needed to step up my program, and what better example than Clancy, who was just pouring himself out for the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and homeless people in Los Angeles. And a life of service, an example that I could admire but never, ever even achieve a tenth of the kind of service that he was giving. So it was good for me because I love the 7 deadly sins. But one of my favorites is sloth, and they will come back at a moment's notice. And so it was always that kind of thing. Clancy, I got this request to speak at Lake Arrowhead. That means, and it's Friday night, driving through traffic and up a mountain. Do we have to do things like that? And he said, "I'd love to talk with you about that, but I've got to catch a plane for Newfoundland where I'm doing a whole bunch of talks." Okay, salute, and off to Lake Arrowhead, I guess. But it was good for me. I began to get happy, and I was happy for a lot of years. There's a line in our literature avoid the deliberate manufacture of misery. And I think it's important to do that. A part of recovery for me has taught me to try to avoid just making life difficult for myself. But sometimes misery just comes knocking on the door. And if you are living life, especially as you get older, you begin to have some losses. And I've had some big ones because I'm old, and it happens. Of course, the worst was one that happened during State Line. It was about 14 years ago. We learned that our son David had taken his own life. And that was a really big one that caused a lot of grief. Our friend Jo here, that reminds me, is here. She just flew in from London yesterday because she just lost her dear mom to death, and she's grieving. But what better place than right here at State Line with her friends? Welcome, Jo. And I was deeply immersed in the fellowship with that loss, and it saw me through. And then years later, about 5 years ago, I lost my sweet Bill, who had stood by me all those years through the full catastrophe. And those later years were very sweet. On his way out, there was a moment when he was actually on hospice care in the living room. And I was saying goodnight to him, telling him I loved him. And he looked up and he said, "Perfect marriage." And I thought, oh my gosh, I've been forgiven. That is so sweet. And then he said, "No, not quite perfect." I know, I was a witch. I mean, actually something that rhymes with it. But then he said, because it only lasted for 60 years. And so I hold that close to my heart. And he crossed over, and he had come to believe. I mean, he heard me talking about God to sponsees for so long. And he had some visits from something beyond, and this physicist somehow was ready to cross over. And he said, "I'll meet you on the other side." And I think that might be true. Our book says we are well in the here and the hereafter. I believe that. A year later, Clancy, August 24th, passed away. And I was without a sponsor, and I knew after Clancy, who could I have? I was 50 years sober, long time sober. But I went to a retreat with Father Tom W. He's a Jesuit Catholic priest, like Father Ed Dowling, spiritual director for Bill Wilson. And very active in the program, long time sober. He does a lot of retreats, and I went to his retreats over the years, really admired him a whole bunch. But 2 weeks after Clancy passed away, he just said, right out of the blue, "You know, I'll sponsor anyone. They often don't call me, but I'll sponsor them." And I saw him in a completely new way, and I thought he would be a great sponsor. So I just sent him a resume. I told him I knew Father Terry, that was his sponsor. And he had to say yes, because he said, "I'll sponsor anyone." And so that's been a very good relationship. Again, just perfect for me at this time in my sobriety. And I've learned many things from him. And it started a whole new adventure as each sponsor gave to me this introduction to that next step of my journey. We entered into the pandemic, another one of these great catastrophes. But there was a thing that became very important to me when our son passed away. There's a person in our group, Julie St. J., and she had lost her son 10 years before. And I knew that she was doing well. And she called me right away, and we talked, and she said, "Marilyn, it's important to accept the loss of your son." And I said, "I can't accept that." And she said, "Acceptance does not mean approval." it just means cooperation with reality. You can do that. Well, I had my doubts about that. But reality, I mean, if you're going to take bets, put your money on reality. It always wins. And so as time went by, I was cooperating with reality. And we began to, I began to have some blessings. As Julie said, if you can just accept, even though you don't approve, you will begin to see that there will be blessings in your life. And I thought, what blessings could come into my life? My life is over. Losses have a way of saying there is an ending, and there can't be any happiness beyond this. I will always be in this state of grief. Well, grief is real, and I believe we must experience it. But it does have an end. And it's a slow thing. An open wound becomes a scar. And the first blessing that I noticed, especially after the loss of our son, was that I listened more carefully. I have a lot of sponsees now, and they are the lifeblood of my program. And I try to listen more carefully. I'm not a great listener, because I love to think about myself while you're talking. But I try harder. And that's one of them. And the other is just a kind of resilience. Each time we live through a loss and realize that there's life beyond that, then the next one that comes along doesn't take quite the toll, because we begin to understand that there is life and goodness beyond that. And certainly there have been blessings. We went through the pandemic, and we were all in lockdown, and when it opened up, I'd begun to sponsor some very active people. And one of them lives up in the Bay Area, Debbie, and she and her husband are travelers, and they sometimes invite me to come along, and they always do all kinds of AA things when they go out of the country. So it's a great adventure. So I joined Debbie and Kent, the wonderful Kent, who is here at State Line, doing all sorts of good things. One of those, we went to Japan, and we went to Egypt. I liked Egypt. I loved Japan. I love these places that we go to. In Egypt, I got to ride on a camel, grandma on a camel, and then we went in pyramids, and they're good. And I was in this pyramid with Jeffrey and Teresa, another couple that went with us, and you go upstairs and you go downstairs, and there are chambers with hieroglyphics. Oh my gosh, it's so fascinating. I was having so much fun. There was one that was a big bat cave with bats squeaking, and yet they were upset and worried. And I said, this is fun. I mean, it's a pyramid. Magic, wonderful. And they didn't get it. They were worried, and finally they confessed why they were not so happy. And they said, well, we're looking at you, and you're so old. And we think you're going to have a heart attack and die. And we don't know how we'll get you out of here. So I said, just think about it. Think of where we are. I mean, it's a pyramid. I mean, it's basically a tomb. It's perfect. Just leave me here. And, well, we all got out and had a good time. Yeah, this thing with Japan has been so magic. We have an outreach to Japan because of the pandemic. Another one of these things that was so terrible. But if we can accept, just accept, cooperate with reality, build a Zoom network, no, excuse me, I should not talk brand names, a virtual network that reaches all over the world. Any place on planet Earth where there is internet, there is AA now. Because of that. And so a wonderful person in our group, Yuko, our current secretary on Wednesday night actually, does many things, and one of the things is because she's bilingual and a good interpreter, has made English-Japanese meetings that we exchange with Japan constantly. And so we have this wonderful marriage of AA, Japanese AA and American AA that has enriched both sides tremendously. And it has been a huge blessing in my life. I go to Japan and participate in the Tokyo Pacific Group, and just feel as at home there as I feel here at State Line with friends. So that has been an enormous blessing. Another blessing that has come was so unexpected, and that was 2 years ago. I got a phone call from my grandson Adam, and there's 4 grandsons, and each one is my very favorite. And Adam is my very favorite. And so he called and he said, "Grandma, I just graduated from college. And I got a job in downtown Los Angeles. Could I move in with you?" And I said, "Of course, Adam, I would love to have you." So Adam moved in. And he is such a delight. We went to music together and movies together, and he wasn't ashamed to be out with Grandma. And had so much fun. He was a little bit sad, though, because his longtime girlfriend was still back in Iowa, where they went to school together. And so she would visit sometimes, and he would visit, but it was a long plane ride and expensive. And so I said, "Adam, would you like for Samantha to move in with us?" "Oh, yes, yes." So we mentioned it to Samantha, and she was on a plane the next day. And so she moved in, and the 3 of us were living there together with Kat Ziva. And a few months ago, I married them because I am Reverend Marilyn. I am a universal life minister, $98 on the internet. And so I was able to officiate, and I've actually been the officiant at the marriage of 3 sponsees and my grandson and Samantha, and it has been so much fun and wonderful. And so we're now there together. I thought when we lost David, my life was over. I always imagined that I'd have David, our beautiful, strong, wonderful son, in my old age. And it was not to be, and it left a big hole in my heart. But Adam fills that spot. He's not David by any means. He's very much Adam. But it has sewn up that hole, and it feels whole. This program has given me everything I need. And it turns out to be everything that I want. And for that, I am most grateful. Thank you. Okay.